I want to start by saying that I've never really been the type to believe in the whole stranger danger thing. Sure, I knew it could happen, but it always felt distant, something you hear about on the news or in true crime documentaries. I guess I just didn't think it could actually touch my life in any real way. I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, and was going to school at NC State. It was your typical college experience, classes during the day, hanging out with friends in between, and the occasional house party on weekends. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But that night changed everything. It was a Friday night, and my roommates Anna and Sarah, along with some other friends, decided to hit up a house party that was happening a little outside of town, near the more rural outskirts. This wasn't unusual for us. College house parties were pretty common, and we'd all gotten used to that routine of cramming into someone's old, rundown house for the night, drinking cheap beer, and dancing to someone's half-broken Bluetooth speaker. It wasn't a big deal, just another typical Friday, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. We drove about 30 minutes to this house in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those big older homes that had definitely seen better days. You could tell the landlord probably wasn't too invested in upkeep, but that was part of the charm for a college party, I guess. The driveway was already packed when we got there, cars lining the gravel road leading up to the house. I remember laughing with Anna and Sarah as we stepped out, shivering a little in the cool November air. None of us had brought jackets, of course, because we didn't want to carry them around all night. Inside, it was the usual scene. People crammed into the living room, kitchen, and even the stairwell. There was some crappy beer pong going on in the dining room, and the music was so loud that you had to yell to hear the person next to you. I remember at one point we all split up. Sarah went to find some drinks, Anna said something about wanting to dance, and I ended up talking to a couple of people I vaguely knew from one of my classes. Hours passed, and the party kept going. I don't remember exactly when I realized I hadn't seen Anna for a while. It was probably around midnight when I thought about it, but I wasn't worried. People at these parties always wandered off with someone they met or ended up crashing in a random bedroom upstairs. Sarah and I had even joked about it when she came over to me later that night and asked if I'd seen Anna. We just assumed she'd gone off with someone. The night went on, and the party started to die down around 2 a.m. Sarah and I were ready to head home, but Anna was nowhere to be found. I texted her a couple of times, but my messages didn't go through. We figured she'd gotten a ride back with someone else, so we didn't think much of it and headed home ourselves. The next morning, though, things got weird. Anna still wasn't back. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and her phone wasn't anywhere to be found. We assumed she was hungover and crashed somewhere else, but as the day wore on and we heard nothing from her, we started to get worried. We checked in with everyone we knew from the party, but no one had seen her after around midnight. The last person who remembered seeing her said she'd been outside talking to someone, but they couldn't remember who. By that evening, Sarah and I were in full panic mode. We called her parents, called the police, and filed a missing person report. They told us it wasn't uncommon for people to go missing after a party, especially if they'd been drinking, but something about this felt different. Anna wasn't the type to just vanish like that. The next day, a few of us went back to the house to look around. We didn't expect to find anything, but we just needed to do something. Most of the party had already cleared out, and the place looked like a wreck. Empty beer cans, red cups, and trash scattered everywhere. But then we found her phone. It was lying on the front lawn, smashed. That's when things started feeling real. Her phone being smashed was weird, but what was even weirder was that no one seemed to remember who she'd been talking to outside. Everyone we asked was either too drunk to remember or hadn't seen anything at all. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. The police got involved in a bigger way after that. They took the phone and started going through surveillance footage from nearby stores and gas stations. I didn't realize until later just how close we had been to a major highway. The party house felt isolated, but it was actually less than a mile from an interstate, which meant someone could have taken her and been gone within minutes. That thought chilled me. A couple of days later, the police called us back in. They had found something on the footage from a convenience store about 5 miles away. It showed Anna, barefoot, walking with some guy. I couldn't make out much from the footage. It was grainy and dark, but you could clearly see her. She looked confused, almost dazed, like she didn't know where she was. The guy she was with? I didn't recognize him. None of us did. That was the last anyone ever saw of her. The police interviewed everyone from the party, combed through all the footage they could find, and even brought in search teams to comb the area. But nothing turned up. No leads, no clues, nothing. It was like she had just disappeared. The guy in the footage was never identified. He wasn't from the party, or at least no one who was there remembered seeing him. Months passed and the police investigation gradually slowed down. Sarah and I moved out of our apartment after that. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with all the memories of Anna everywhere. Every day was filled with questions, paranoia, and what-ifs. What if we'd gone looking for her that night? What if we hadn't assumed she was fine? What if someone had seen her with that man before they left the party? None of it helped. But I couldn't stop my mind from racing. I kept replaying everything from that night in my head, searching for something, anything, that I might have missed. I couldn't understand how someone could just disappear like that, how we could have been so close but still not seen what was happening. And the guy in the footage? He haunted my thoughts. There was nothing particularly unusual about him, just a guy, blending into the background like he could be anyone. After that, I became more cautious. Every time I went out, I scanned the room looking for anyone who seemed out of place. I didn't want to end up like Anna, just another missing person report that fades away over time. Her parents tried to stay hopeful for a while, but as time passed with no answers, even they started to give up. It was like watching someone slowly drown, knowing you couldn't do anything to save them. The hardest part was the not knowing. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock on the door, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would be news about Anna. But it never was. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and still, no one had any answers. I'm not sure what happened to Anna that night. I've read so many theories online about human trafficking, abduction, and even that she just ran away. But I know Anna, and she wouldn't just leave like that, not without telling someone, not without a reason. Sometimes I drive past the house where the party was held. It looks the same, just as run down and unremarkable as it did that night. It's hard to believe that a place so ordinary could be the site of something so terrible. I guess that's the scariest part of all, that this kind of thing doesn't just happen in horror movies or on TV. It can happen anywhere, even in places you think are safe. Anna's case is still open, but as far as I know, there haven't been any new leads in years. It's like the world just moved on without her, and that terrifies me. There's this unshakable feeling that whoever took her is still out there, blending into the background, unnoticed and undetected, just waiting for the next opportunity. And that could be anyone's worst nightmare. Someone watching you when you don't even realize it. Someone following you home when you think you're safe. About 3 years ago, I was living in a quiet little suburb just outside of Denver. It was one of those areas where nothing much ever happens. Nice houses, quiet streets, families, and retirees. You know the type of place where you recognize your neighbors and wave at each other when you drive by. It was calm, predictable, and honestly a little boring, which is exactly why I liked it. I was renting this small house with my boyfriend at the time. The house was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a driveway that barely fit both our cars. We'd moved there for the peace and quiet after spending years in the noise and chaos of downtown Denver, where you can hear your neighbors through the walls and there's always some loud music or honking cars to remind you how cramped city life can be. This place was supposed to be a break from all that. One weekend, we decided to throw a small barbecue at our place. It was midsummer and the weather was perfect, so it seemed like the right way to enjoy the day. We invited a few friends, nothing big, just about 8 or 9 people. Everyone was excited about spending the afternoon outside, grilling burgers and drinking beers. It was supposed to be laid back, just a few hours of catching up with friends and enjoying the weekend. Around 3 p.m., people started showing up. We had music playing on a Bluetooth speaker, and my boyfriend was working the grill while I prepped some snacks inside. Everyone was in a good mood, and the smell of grilling meat was filling the air. The sun was bright, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was one of those perfect summer days where everything feels right. We were out in the backyard chatting and laughing when one of my friends, Emily, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She was facing the back of the yard, and when I looked at her, she had this strange look on her face, like she'd just seen something that didn't belong. I followed her gaze and noticed the man standing in the window of the house next door. The house next door belonged to an older man, probably in his 60s or 70s. I'd only seen him a few times in passing, and I didn't know much about him other than that he kept to himself. His house was kind of run down compared to the others in the neighborhood. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn, and the blinds were always drawn, giving off this shut-in vibe. I'd never really thought much about him until that moment. He was standing at his window, staring directly into our backyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there watching. His face was partially obscured by the reflection on the glass, but you could tell he was fixated on us. We all stopped talking for a second, just staring back at him, unsure of what to do. It felt awkward, like we were being rude for looking back at him even though he was the one watching us. After a few seconds, we laughed it off and tried to continue with the party, but it was hard to ignore the fact that he hadn't moved. At first, I brushed it off as the kind of thing that happens when people live close to each other. Maybe he was just curious, or maybe he was lonely and hadn't seen anyone outside in a while. But as the hours went on, he didn't stop. Every time I glanced over at his house, he was still there, standing in that same spot, staring at us. He didn't even try to hide it. By now, everyone had noticed, and it was starting to make people uncomfortable. Emily kept glancing over at the window, making these nervous jokes about the creepy neighbor, but no one was laughing anymore. The vibe had shifted. It was hard to enjoy the party when you knew someone was watching your every move. Eventually, my boyfriend went over to the fence and waved at the man, trying to break the tension. I could see him smiling, trying to play it off as if it was no big deal, but the man didn't wave back. He just stood there, completely still, staring. I couldn't even tell if he blinked. After a few more seconds, my boyfriend shrugged and walked back to the group, clearly as unsettled as the rest of us. We tried to continue the party, but the energy was gone. Everyone kept looking back at the window, waiting for the man to stop or do something else. I felt this weird tension in the air, like we were all trapped under his gaze, and no matter how much we tried to ignore it, it wasn't going away. Around 7 p.m., the sun started to set, and we decided to call it a night. People left in small groups, muttering goodbyes and casting uneasy glances at the neighbor's house. He was still standing there, even as the sky darkened. I thought about going over to his house and asking if everything was okay, but something about the way he just stood there made me feel like it wasn't a good idea. Once everyone had left, my boyfriend and I cleaned up the yard and headed inside. We didn't talk about the neighbor much, but I could tell it was bothering both of us. Before we went to bed, I peeked through the blinds, half expecting him to still be at the window, but the lights in his house were off, and the blinds were drawn. I didn't think much more about it that night. Maybe he was just a lonely old man with nothing better to do. Maybe he'd been curious about the noise and hadn't realized how long he'd been staring. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal, but part of me felt uneasy. There was something off about the whole thing, something I couldn't shake. The next morning I was up early making coffee and getting ready to run some errands. My boyfriend had already left for work, and the house was quiet. I grabbed my coffee and wandered into the living room, still feeling a little unsettled from the day before. That's when I saw it. The man was back at his window, staring directly into our house. It was early, barely 7 a.m., and there he was, standing in the same spot just like the day before. His face was as expressionless as ever, and he didn't move when I saw him. It was like he'd been waiting for me to come into the room. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart started pounding in my chest, and for a moment I thought about going outside to confront him. But something about the way he just stood there, so still, so silent, made me hesitate. Instead, I pulled the curtains shut, blocking him out of view. I spent the rest of the morning feeling on edge. Every time I walked past a window, I resisted the urge to peek outside, afraid of what I might see. I kept telling myself that he was harmless, that he was just a weird old man, but it was getting harder to believe that. It felt like he was watching me specifically, and that thought sent a chill down my spine. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Every time I glanced out the window, there he was, standing in the same spot, staring at our house. He never came outside, never moved from his window, but he was always there. My boyfriend saw him too, but neither of us knew what to do. Confronting him didn't feel like an option anymore. It felt too risky, too unpredictable. One evening, after a few days of this, I finally decided to call the police. I wasn't sure what to say, but I knew I couldn't just let this go on. I explained the situation as best as I could, telling them about the man standing at his window, watching us. The dispatcher was polite, but didn't seem to think it was a big deal. They said they'd send someone out to check on him, but they made it clear that unless he was doing something threatening, there wasn't much they could do. A couple of officers came by later that night. They knocked on the man's door, but no one answered. They circled the house a few times, peering through the windows, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. After a few minutes they left, telling us to call again if we noticed anything unusual. That night, I slept poorly, constantly waking up to check if the man was still there. But when I looked out the window, the house was dark and he was nowhere to be seen. I wanted to believe it was over, that maybe the police visit had scared him off or made him realize how creepy he was being. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with texts from Emily. She was freaking out. She had seen something online about the man next door. The headline was chilling. Man found dead in Denver home, deceased for days. I clicked the link, my stomach twisting as I read. The article said that the body of an elderly man had been found in his home after a concerned neighbor reported a foul smell. He had apparently died of natural causes several days earlier. Several days. I couldn't breathe. If he had been dead for days, then who had been standing at that window watching us? A few years ago, when I was in high school, my friends and I thought it was a great idea to throw a party while one of our friends' parents were out of town. This happened in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, in a pretty typical two-story house that you'd find in any middle-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a regular place that always felt safe and familiar. I'd been to my friend Matt's house plenty of times before, so nothing about the place ever struck me as unusual. Matt's parents were strict, so we didn't get a lot of chances to hang out there unless they were out of town. This was one of those weekends when we finally had the freedom to do whatever we wanted. The plan was simple. About 20 or so people, mostly from our school, would come over, we'd drink, listen to music, and have a good time. Typical high school party stuff. The night started pretty normal. We had a couple of cases of cheap beer and some liquor someone's older brother had bought for us. It was the usual scene. People hanging out in the living room, some out on the back porch, and a few in the kitchen around the drinks. Everyone was just having a good time, nothing out of the ordinary. I remember it was freezing outside, but inside the house was warm, the kind of cozy you only feel in winter when you're sheltered from the cold. As the night went on, a few of us started exploring the house. Matt's house wasn't huge, but there were always little spots that felt like they hadn't been touched in years. I'm talking about cluttered storage rooms, random closets filled with old junk, stuff like that. A couple of us were feeling buzzed and decided it'd be fun to check out the basement. I'd never been down there before, and from what Matt had told me, his parents used it mainly for storage. Apparently, they hadn't gone down there much either. We grabbed a couple of flashlights because the basement light barely worked. The switch at the top of the stairs flickered on, but it was dim, and Matt said the bulb down there was burned out. The rest of the house felt alive and full of energy, but as soon as we opened that basement door, things got quiet. It's not like anyone was paying attention to us heading down there, but it just felt different. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. Just the usual spooky basement vibe. There were 5 of us: Matt, me, and 3 others: Jake, Sarah, and Emily. We were all laughing as we headed down, the kind of dumb, nervous laughter you get when you're trying to act brave, but something doesn't feel right. The stairs creaked under our feet, and the air down there was cooler, kind of stale. The basement was mostly unfinished: cement floors, exposed pipes, and random piles of boxes and old furniture pushed up against the walls. The smell of dust hit me immediately, and I could see cobwebs hanging in the corners of the ceiling. We were just messing around at first, poking through some of the old boxes and seeing if we could find anything interesting. There was a lot of old junk down there, things Matt's family had probably forgotten about. Old clothes, Christmas decorations, boxes of books, stuff like that. I remember Jake pulling out a beat-up suitcase and joking about it looking like something from a horror movie, but we all just laughed it off. That's when we noticed something weird in the corner. Behind a stack of boxes, there was this old mattress on the floor. It wasn't just thrown there haphazardly either. It looked like someone had been sleeping on it recently. The sheets were rumpled, and there was an old blanket draped over the top. Next to it was a pile of empty food wrappers, cans, and some bottles of water. Everything looked dirty, like it had been there for a while, but not long enough to be abandoned. It was the kind of mess you'd expect from someone who didn't plan on sticking around forever, but had been there long enough to leave a trail. We all kind of paused when we saw it, trying to make sense of what we were looking at. At first, it didn't click. I mean, who would be living in Matt's basement without anyone knowing? That's when Emily noticed something even more unsettling. There were clothes piled up near the mattress. Not just random clothes either. They were men's clothes: shirts, pants, and a jacket. They looked way too big to belong to anyone in Matt's family, especially his parents. It was clear these things didn't belong to anyone who lived there. Matt, who had been laughing and messing around like the rest of us, suddenly went quiet. You could see the confusion on his face, trying to figure out what the hell was going on in his own house. He swore he had no idea how the stuff got there, and honestly, I believed him. There was no way he would have let us go down there if he knew someone had been squatting in his basement. Jake, always the bold one, started poking around the mattress with his foot. He flipped over one of the pillows, and underneath it we found something that made my stomach drop. A phone. It was an old model, one that looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but still, it was unsettling. We didn't touch it at first. The whole situation was starting to feel more real, like we had just stumbled into something we weren't supposed to find. At this point, Matt was freaking out. He kept saying he had no idea how any of this stuff got there, that he hadn't been down to the basement in months, and that his parents never used it for anything other than storage. We all started looking around the basement more closely, and that's when we realized something else. The back door was unlocked. There was a small, half-broken door that led out into the backyard. It wasn't big, just one of those doors that you'd use for taking things in and out of the basement. It looked like someone had been coming and going through that door, and none of us had noticed. There were marks on the floor, like someone had been dragging things in and out, and the lock on the door was busted. It didn't take much to push it open. That's when the fear really set in. Someone had been living in Matt's basement, someone who didn't belong there, and they had easy access to the house. We had been upstairs all night, partying, drinking, and having fun, completely unaware that someone could have been right beneath our feet the whole time. Matt, now in full-on panic mode, told us we needed to leave the basement and go back upstairs. He was already pulling out his phone, probably to call his parents or the cops. We didn't argue with him. The whole mood of the night had shifted from fun and carefree to tense and unsettling. As we started heading back toward the stairs, I remember hearing something, just a faint sound, like a shuffle or creak. We all froze. It was coming from near the back of the basement, where the shadows were thicker, where we hadn't really looked yet. At first, I thought it might be one of us stepping on something, but when we turned around, I saw it. The back door, the one that led outside, was slightly ajar. None of us had touched it. I don't know if it was the wind or if someone had been watching us the entire time and quietly slipped out, but the door was definitely open, just a crack, and none of us had gone near it. The adrenaline kicked in and we all bolted up the stairs, not saying a word. When we reached the top, Matt slammed the basement door shut and locked it. We didn't go back down there for the rest of the night. The party kept going upstairs, but the 5 of us who had been in the basement couldn't shake what we had seen. It was like we had discovered something we weren't supposed to. Something that had been going on for a while without anyone knowing. Matt called his parents, and they told him to leave it alone and they'd deal with it when they got home. He didn't call the cops right away, probably because we were all a little freaked out and not thinking clearly. The rest of the night we stayed upstairs trying to act like everything was normal, but none of us were really in the mood to party anymore. Every creak in the house, every little noise made us jump. We didn't know if the person was still around or if they'd left, but it didn't matter. The idea that someone had been living right under our noses was enough to put everyone on edge. The next day, Matt's parents came home, and he told them everything. They ended up calling the police, and an officer came by to check out the basement. I wasn't there for that part, but Matt told me later that the cop didn't find much. The clothes and the food wrappers were still there, but whoever had been living down there was long gone by then. The busted lock on the back door was the only real evidence that someone had been coming and going. I don't know how long that person had been staying in Matt's basement. Could have been days, could have been weeks. All I know is that we had been partying upstairs, completely unaware that a stranger had been living in the same house, probably listening to everything we were doing, maybe even watching us when we didn't know it. After that night, none of us felt comfortable at Matt's house anymore. We stopped hanging out there, even after his parents changed the locks and supposedly fixed the problem. It just didn't feel safe anymore. Knowing that someone could slip into your life like that, unnoticed, is one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. This happened a few years ago when I was in my early 20s. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, even though I try not to. I still can't fully process how close we were to something really bad happening, and it scares me to think about what might have happened if things had gone even slightly differently. It started like most weekends did back then. A few friends and I had planned to hit up an underground party in Los Angeles. We weren't into clubs as much, and these house parties had a sort of reputation for being more laid back but still pretty wild. You'd hear about them through word of mouth or get an address sent to you last minute from someone who knew someone. It was the kind of thing where you had to show up at the right place at the right time, and there wasn't much room for error. Looking back, that should have been the first red flag, but when you're young, you don't really think about that stuff. There were 4 of us that night. Me, my friend Brian, his girlfriend Liz, and another guy named Derek. We'd gone to a few parties like this before, and nothing weird had ever happened, so we didn't expect anything out of the ordinary this time either. The party was supposed to be in this more secluded area on the outskirts of the city. We got the address from a friend of a friend and set out around 10 p.m. I remember thinking how far out it seemed compared to other parties we'd been to, but I didn't question it too much. LA is a big place, and parties could be anywhere. The drive took us longer than expected because the address was tucked away in a residential area that we weren't familiar with. The streets were narrow and winding, the kind of place where you feel like you're far away from the city, even though it's not that far as the crow flies. The houses were spread out, separated by large plots of land with a lot of trees and bushes that blocked the view of most homes from the street. It had this almost rural vibe, which felt strange given we were still technically in LA. We finally pulled up to the house that matched the address, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the location, it was the house itself. Most of the homes we passed were modern or at least updated, but this one looked old, almost run down. The windows were dark and the driveway was empty except for a single beat-up truck parked near the garage. Still, there was this faint sound of music coming from inside. It wasn't the loud, thumping bass you'd expect at a party, but more like distant background noise. The lights were on in the front hallway and we could see a few shadows moving around inside. I remember Brian saying something about how the house didn't look like it could host a party. We all agreed it seemed strange, but no one wanted to be the one to turn around after driving all that way. The place was isolated, and we figured maybe it was one of those exclusive, low-key parties where they kept things quiet to avoid noise complaints. People in LA could be weird about noise, especially in these wealthier neighborhoods. The fact that there weren't many cars around made sense to us at the time. It was still early, and people probably parked down the road to avoid clogging the driveway. So against our better judgment, we knocked on the door. A man answered. I'll never forget his face. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and a tired look in his eyes. He was dressed casually, like he'd just thrown on whatever was lying around, but something about the way he looked at us made me uneasy. There was this awkward pause before he finally opened the door wider and waved us in. I could feel the tension between us all as we stepped inside. The house was just as unsettling as it had looked from the outside. It wasn't dirty or anything, but it was sparsely decorated with old furniture and a musty smell in the air, like it hadn't been lived in properly for years. The music we'd heard from outside was barely audible now, coming from a small radio in the corner of the room. There were only a handful of people inside, maybe 4 or 5, and they all looked at us like they weren't expecting us. Everyone seemed a little too calm, sitting around in different parts of the living room, barely talking to each other. It didn't feel like a party at all. I kept telling myself it was just a slow start, that more people would show up soon. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Brian and Derek were looking around, clearly as uncomfortable as I was, but no one said anything. Liz, on the other hand, seemed more annoyed than scared, whispering to Brian that we should leave if nothing was happening soon. The man who had let us in didn't make things any better. He hovered near us, asking weird questions about how we found the place and who had told us about the party. He didn't seem mad, just off. He kept making small talk, asking us if we wanted a drink or if we needed anything. There was no real bar set up, just a few bottles of cheap liquor sitting on the kitchen counter. None of us took him up on the offer. I think we all had the same thought at that point. Get out of here, but do it in a way that doesn't raise any suspicion. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like we'd walked into the wrong place, like this wasn't a party at all. The other people in the room weren't drinking, weren't dancing, weren't doing anything but sitting and watching us. They weren't rude, but they weren't exactly welcoming either. They barely even talked to each other, just exchanging these weird glances while the man kept asking us questions. I could feel the tension building. It was like the air in the room was getting heavier, and all I could think about was getting out of there. I didn't want to be rude, didn't want to make a scene, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. Brian must have felt the same way, because after a few more awkward minutes, he made some excuse about needing to make a call and suggested we step outside for a minute. The man didn't stop us, but he watched us closely as we made our way to the door. As soon as we were outside, we practically sprinted to the car. Liz was the first to speak up, saying she didn't care what was going on in there, she just wanted to leave. Derek was on his phone, scrolling through messages, trying to figure out if we'd gotten the wrong address. And that's when we realized we had. Derek showed us the message he'd gotten from the friend who told him about the party. There had been a second text that we hadn't seen, one that gave a more detailed address. The house we were supposed to be at was just down the street, barely half a mile away. We'd walked into the wrong house. But the weirdest part? That man had let us in like he was expecting us. He hadn't questioned why a group of strangers was at his door in the middle of the night. hadn't mentioned anything about there being no party. It was like he wanted us there, like we had fallen right into his lap. As we were pulling out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house. The man was standing in the doorway, watching us leave. His face was blank, almost expressionless. The people inside hadn't moved, hadn't come outside, hadn't said a word. They were still sitting there, as if they'd just been waiting for something to happen. We drove down the street to the actual party, and when we got there, it was exactly what we'd expected. People, music, drinks, the whole thing. But none of us could get into it after what had just happened. We stayed for maybe an hour before leaving. I couldn't stop thinking about the house we'd just left, about how easily we had walked into a stranger's home without even realizing it. The rest of the night I kept replaying everything in my head. What if we hadn't realized we were in the wrong place? What if we'd stayed longer? What if we hadn't made an excuse to leave? I have no idea what was going on in that house, but something about it didn't feel right. The way that man looked at us, the way the other people acted, like they were waiting for something, it still gives me chills. I don't know if that man was just lonely, if it was some kind of weird gathering, or if something worse was going on. All I know is that we got lucky that night. We could have easily stayed longer, tried to blend in, waited for more people to show up, but something told us to leave, and we listened. I've never been back to that neighborhood, and I don't plan on ever going near it again. Even now, years later, I still think about that house, about the man who let us in without hesitation. I don't know what we walked into that night, but whatever it was, I'm just glad we got out when we did. A couple of summers ago, my friends and I rented this vacation house for the weekend in Ocean City, Maryland. It was meant to be a relaxing beach trip, just a group of us escaping the city for a few days. We had all been stressed with work, and this was supposed to be our way of unwinding. I'd known everyone going since college. My best friend Jess, her boyfriend Evan, our friend Sarah, and a few others from our old group. We'd done trips like this before, but none of us could have predicted what was going to happen this time. The house itself was your typical beach rental. It wasn't huge, but it had 3 bedrooms, a big living room, and was just a short walk from the beach. We found it online through one of those vacation rental websites. The pictures looked great and the price was decent, so we booked it without much thought. It was one of those places that look a little older in person than it does online, but we didn't care too much. We weren't planning on spending a lot of time indoors anyway. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, sunny with a slight breeze, and we were all pumped to spend the weekend chilling on the beach, grilling in the backyard, and just having fun. That first day was great. We unpacked, grabbed some drinks, and headed straight to the sand. By the time we got back to the house that night, we were all sunburned, a little tipsy, and ready to relax. The night started like any other vacation night. We grilled out on the deck, had a few more drinks, and eventually ended up playing some music and dancing around the living room. It was the kind of carefree vibe that made you forget about everything else for a while. We were laughing, making a mess of the kitchen with late-night snacks, and generally just being idiots. I don't remember what time it was when I realized I couldn't find my phone. I'd had it with me earlier, but after a few drinks and moving around the house, I lost track of it. I figured I'd left it in one of the bedrooms, so I started looking. I was stumbling around a bit, feeling the alcohol in my system, and I remember thinking it was a pain to retrace my steps. I went into one of the bedrooms first, thinking maybe I'd left it there when I was changing earlier, but no luck. Then I wandered into the second bedroom where Jess and Evan had already crashed out, so I didn't bother them. Finally, I ended up in the third bedroom. It was the one Sarah and I were sharing, but she was still up with the others, so it was empty. I was digging around the room, lifting up clothes and checking under the bed, when I noticed something strange. The room was dark, but there was this faint, barely noticeable hole in the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just some wear and tear from the old house, but the more I looked at it, the weirder it seemed. It wasn't just some random crack. It was a small, perfectly round hole, barely the size of a dime. I climbed onto the bed to get a closer look, and when I did, I realized the hole was directly above the shower in the adjoining bathroom. It was the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were really looking for it. My first thought was that it had something to do with plumbing, or maybe it was just old damage from a leak. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It was too clean, too precise. I didn't say anything at first, just brushed it off as me being paranoid or imagining things. But as the night went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, after we'd all slept off the alcohol, I casually brought it up with Sarah while we were getting ready for the beach. She laughed it off at first, saying it was probably just some old damage, but then we both went back into the bedroom and looked at it together. That's when she started to get uneasy too. We called Jess and Evan into the room, and they both agreed that the hole looked weird. It didn't make sense for it to be there, especially in such a strange spot. We started joking about it, half-heartedly making light of the situation, but you could tell that everyone was starting to feel uneasy. Jess suggested we check the other rooms just in case, so we did. That's when things got worse. In the other 2 bedrooms, we found similar holes, all in places where you'd least expect to notice them. One was near the ceiling vent in Jess and Evan's room, and another was tucked in a corner of the living room ceiling, almost hidden behind a beam. They weren't super obvious, but now that we knew what to look for, it was clear they were there for a reason. That's when Evan pulled out his phone and started Googling hidden cameras. He had this weird look on his face, like he was trying not to freak us out, but we could tell he was getting more serious about it. He said that a lot of times these cameras are hidden in vents, smoke detectors, or even behind walls with tiny holes for the lens to peek through. That's when we all started to panic a little. Sarah was the one who got the bright idea to check the vents. We took the cover off one of the vents in the living room, and sure enough, there was a small black object hidden inside, tucked behind the slats. It was a camera. We didn't touch it at first, just stared at it like it was some kind of bomb about to go off. None of us could believe it. We'd heard stories about this kind of thing happening, but it was always something that happened to someone else. Not us, not on our trip. We immediately went into a full-blown panic mode, tearing through the house looking for more cameras. We found another one hidden behind a smoke detector in the kitchen, and one more in the master bathroom. Every room we checked seemed to have some kind of surveillance device hidden in it. It was terrifying. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that we had been in the house for almost 24 hours, using the bathrooms, changing clothes, and doing all kinds of things without knowing we were being watched. Jess started crying, and I wasn't far from it myself. Evan was pacing around, swearing under his breath, trying to figure out what to do. None of us knew who had set up the cameras or how long they'd been there. We didn't even know if they were recording us live or if someone was going to come back later to collect the footage. It felt like we had been violated in the worst possible way. The idea that someone could have been watching us the whole time, listening to us, seeing everything we did, it made my skin crawl. Evan called the rental company right away, but it took a while to get through to someone. By the time we explained what was going on, the person on the other end of the line didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation. They told us they'd send someone to check the house, but they didn't seem too concerned. That only made us angrier. We packed up our stuff immediately, not caring that we still had another day left in the rental. There was no way we were staying in that house for another second. I remember walking out to the car with my bags, looking over my shoulder like someone might be watching us leave. It was the most uncomfortable feeling I've ever experienced, knowing that everything we did could have been recorded by someone we didn't even know. As we drove away, I kept looking at my phone, half expecting some creepy message to pop up from whoever had been watching us. It felt like we were getting away from something dangerous, even though there hadn't been any direct confrontation. The idea that someone had set up that house with the intention of spying on whoever rented it was terrifying enough on its own. We spent the rest of the day at a nearby hotel trying to figure out what to do. We debated whether we should go to the police, but Evan said it might be better to wait until we heard back from the rental company. We didn't have any concrete evidence aside from the cameras we'd found, and none of us wanted to stick around Ocean City any longer than we had to. The whole trip was ruined. By the time we finally heard back from the rental company, they told us they hadn't found anything unusual when they sent someone to check the house. That sent all of us into a rage. How could they not have found anything when we'd literally seen the cameras with our own eyes? We tried explaining again, but they just brushed us off, telling us there wasn't anything they could do without proof. It was infuriating. We never got a real explanation for what happened. The cameras were there, but we don't know if they were live or if someone had planted them to record renters for later. We ended up leaving a ton of negative reviews for the house and the rental company, but I doubt it did much good. To this day, I don't know if the cameras were ever removed, or if the next group of people who rented the place had the same thing happen to them. This happened a couple of years ago, back when I was still living in Chicago. I was in my mid-20s, working full-time, and living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was in a good neighborhood, and I loved being close to the lake and all the bars and restaurants around. I was pretty comfortable with my life at that point. Good friends, a decent job, and enough going on to keep me busy without feeling overwhelmed. One of my close friends, Olivia, was having her birthday party at a house that her boyfriend had rented for the weekend. It was a big deal because they'd gone all out, renting this huge place in a more secluded area near Oak Park. I hadn't seen Olivia in a couple of weeks, so I was excited to catch up and celebrate. The plan was to meet at the house in the early evening, hang out, have a few drinks, and maybe stay the night if things went late. It was the usual sort of thing, nothing I hadn't done before. I got to the house around 7 p.m. It was a nice place, bigger than I expected, with plenty of room for everyone who was coming. Olivia and her boyfriend James had invited a good mix of people. Some I knew well and others I'd met once or twice at different parties. The vibe was relaxed at first, just people chatting, drinking, and eating the appetizers James had ordered. I was catching up with Olivia when I noticed this guy standing near the back of the room, someone I didn't recognize. He wasn't doing anything weird, just standing there, drink in hand, sort of blending into the background. He was tall, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. I figured he was one of James's friends or maybe someone Olivia knew from work. He didn't seem out of place or anything, just a face I didn't know. The party was getting more crowded as people arrived, so I didn't think much of it at the time. As the night went on, things got louder and more chaotic, like they always do when people start drinking. I was bouncing around from group to group, catching up with different friends and having a good time. I noticed the guy a few more times throughout the night. He was always nearby but never really interacting with anyone. I chalked it up to him being shy or not knowing many people. He didn't seem to be drinking much, and I thought maybe he was just one of those people who didn't party as hard as the rest of us. Still, I found myself glancing over at him every now and then, wondering why he hadn't really talked to anyone. By the time it got late, around midnight, the party was in full swing. Music was blasting, people were dancing, and things were getting more chaotic. I'd had a few drinks by that point, enough to feel buzzed, but not enough to be totally out of it. I was in the kitchen with Olivia and a few others when I noticed the guy again. This time he was closer, standing just outside the kitchen, leaning against the wall. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just sort of watching the room. I felt a little uneasy, but again I figured it was just me overthinking things. There were plenty of people around, and he wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, it was strange that he hadn't interacted with anyone all night. I asked Olivia if she knew him, but she shrugged and said he was probably a friend of James's. I didn't push it, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. The party started to wind down around 2 a.m., and people began heading out or crashing in one of the spare rooms. I wasn't planning on staying the night, so I called for an Uber. While I was waiting outside, I noticed the guy standing by the door smoking a cigarette. He glanced over at me, but neither of us said anything. My Uber pulled up a few minutes later and I got in, ready to head home. The ride back to my apartment was uneventful. just the usual late-night quiet streets of Chicago. I got dropped off in front of my building, went inside, and crashed into bed without thinking too much about the party. But the next morning, things started to feel off. I woke up to a text from an unknown number. It was one of those messages where someone tries to play it off as if they know you. Something like, "Hey, saw you at the party last night. You looked great." At first, I thought it was a joke or maybe someone from the party who'd gotten my number through a friend, but I didn't recognize the number and the whole thing just felt weird. I replied with a simple, "Who is this?" but didn't get a response. I brushed it off as some random drunk person texting the wrong number and went about my day. A few days went by and I didn't think about it again until another text came in from the same number. This one was more direct, saying something like, "I've seen you around, we should hang out sometime." Now I was starting to get creeped out. Whoever this was clearly knew me, or at least had seen me recently, and they were being vague enough to make it unsettling. I didn't respond this time, just blocked the number and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. I'd see someone standing across the street when I left my apartment, watching me as I walked to the bus stop. Or I'd catch a glimpse of someone in the crowd at the grocery store who seemed a little too interested in what I was doing. At first, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But then the texts started again, from different numbers, each one saying similar things like they knew me or had seen me recently. It wasn't every day, but enough to make me feel like I couldn't just ignore it. I told Olivia about it and she suggested I go to the police. I wasn't sure what I could even tell them. There was no clear threat, just these vague messages and a feeling that someone was watching me. So I held off on going to the police, thinking maybe it would just stop on its own. But it didn't. One night I was coming home from work, walking up to my building when I saw him, the guy from the party. He was standing across the street, leaning against a parked car, just watching me. He wasn't trying to hide or anything, just standing there, staring. My heart started racing and I fumbled with my keys, trying to get inside as quickly as possible. I didn't want to run because I didn't want him to know I was scared. But the second I was inside, I locked the door and looked through the peephole. He was still there. I stood there for a while, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't move. I called Olivia, my voice shaking, and told her what was happening. She was freaked out too and told me to call the police. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called 911 and explained that someone had been following me, sending me texts, and now was standing outside my building. By the time the police arrived, the guy was gone. They took my statement, asked if I knew who he was, but all I could tell them was that I'd seen him at Olivia's party and that I didn't even know his name. They told me they'd keep an eye on the area, but didn't really seem to think it was that serious. I felt stupid, like I'd overreacted, but at the same time I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. After that night, the texts stopped for a while and I didn't see the guy again. I tried to move on, to tell myself that it was just some random creep who'd lost interest. But a few weeks later, I found a note taped to my door. It didn't say much, just, "I've been thinking about you." But the handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. My stomach dropped when I saw it. He'd been to my apartment, and the police hadn't done anything to stop him. That's when I started getting really scared. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I double-checked the locks every night, kept the curtains closed, and barely went out unless I had to. I considered moving, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. I felt trapped, like I was waiting for something terrible to happen. I didn't see the guy again for a long time after that. No more texts, no more sightings, nothing. It was like he'd vanished. Part of me hoped he had just gotten bored and moved on. But the fear never really left. Every time I left my apartment, I was looking over my shoulder, scanning the street for any sign of him. I never knew if he was still watching or if he was just waiting for the right moment to show up again. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city. It helped, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere. I don't know why he chose me or what his intentions were, but that's what scares me the most, the not knowing. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. A couple of years ago, I was living in New York City. It was one of those nights out that starts off completely normal, fun even, but ends in a way that makes you question everything. I was out celebrating a friend's birthday in the East Village, nothing out of the ordinary. A few drinks, some bar hopping, laughing, and dancing with people I'd known for years. The city was alive like it always is on weekends, and the bars were packed with people spilling onto the streets. It was just another night in Manhattan. There were 5 of us that night, me, my roommate Claire, and 3 other friends, Kelly, Jason, and Erica. We'd all met up around 9 p.m. at this dive bar on Avenue A, one of those places where the lights are dim, the drinks are cheap, and the music is always a little too loud. We spent a few hours there before deciding to move to another bar around 11. Kelly was the birthday girl, and she wanted to keep the night going, so we hopped around a bit, stopping at a couple more places as we moved uptown. By the time it was past 2 a.m., we were all pretty drunk, but still coherent enough to know we needed to start heading home. We were tired, and the excitement of the night had finally started to wear off. None of us lived too far from each other, all in the same general area in Brooklyn, so we decided to share a cab to split the cost. It made sense, especially since trying to grab an Uber after midnight in the city can be a nightmare. There's always surge pricing and the wait times can be ridiculous. We left the bar around 2:30 a.m. and walked to a nearby street to hail a yellow cab. It was one of those humid New York summer nights, the street still full of people, even that late. We flagged down a taxi pretty quickly, which felt like a small victory in itself, and piled in. Kelly got in first, sitting up front next to the driver, and the rest of us crammed into the back seat. I remember feeling a little cramped, but I didn't care because we were finally heading home. Our plan was simple. The taxi would drop us off one by one. I was supposed to be last since my apartment was the farthest from where we started. Claire was closest, so we headed toward her place first, which was in Park Slope, about a 20-minute drive from where we were in Manhattan. The drive started off fine, the usual chatter and jokes, with all of us half complaining about how tired we were. The streets were mostly empty and we didn't hit much traffic, which was a relief. The first stop was Claire's. We dropped her off outside her building and she waved goodbye as she disappeared into the lobby. The rest of us were still in good spirits, joking around and recapping the night. Next up was Erica, who lived in the same neighborhood, just a few blocks from Claire. We dropped her off without any issue, and now it was just me, Jason, and Kelly. Kelly was sitting up front, still chatting with the driver about random things, probably more talkative than she would have been if she were sober. I was half paying attention to the conversation, zoning in and out, while Jason was dozing off next to me in the back. I didn't think much of it, just glad the night was almost over, and I'd be home soon. The plan was to drop Jason off next, and then me, with Kelly being the last since her place was closest to the final stop. We were driving through a quieter part of Brooklyn when I realized Jason had fallen asleep, his head leaning against the window. Kelly was still up front, laughing at something the driver had said, and I was fading fast myself. I remember looking out the window, watching the buildings pass by, trying to stay awake. The streets were mostly deserted at that point, the only sounds being the hum of the car and the occasional passing vehicle. I don't know how long I zoned out, but at some point I noticed that Kelly had gotten quiet. I didn't think too much of it at first, figuring she was just tired like the rest of us. But when I looked up, I saw that she wasn't in the front seat anymore. The passenger seat was empty. I blinked, confused, trying to remember if we'd already dropped her off, but I knew we hadn't. The last thing I remembered was that she'd been talking just minutes earlier. I shook Jason awake, groggy and disoriented, and asked him if he'd seen Kelly get out of the cab. He looked as confused as I felt, rubbing his eyes and mumbling something about not knowing. I leaned forward and asked the driver where Kelly had gone, but he just shrugged, saying she'd gotten out a few minutes ago at her stop. The thing is, I didn't remember stopping. I didn't remember her saying anything about getting out. One second she'd been there, and the next, she was gone. I started to panic a little, asking Jason again if he was sure he hadn't seen her get out. He swore he hadn't noticed anything, but he'd been half asleep for most of the ride. We hadn't stopped anywhere unusual, just kept driving along the same route, and I didn't remember her saying goodbye or getting out. I tried to tell myself that maybe I'd missed it. Maybe I'd been zoning out, and she'd slipped out quietly, but something didn't sit right. When we reached Jason's place, I asked him to stay in the cab with me until I figured out what had happened to Kelly. I grabbed my phone and tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. No ringing, no nothing, just her recorded message. I tried again and the same thing happened. Now I was really starting to freak out. I knew Kelly wouldn't just leave without saying anything, and she wouldn't ignore my calls. Jason tried to calm me down, saying she'd probably just gotten out when we weren't paying attention, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We both got out of the cab at Jason's stop, and I stood there on the sidewalk, watching as the driver pulled away. The street was empty, and the quiet felt deafening. Jason kept telling me it was fine, that she was probably already home, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I called her again and once again straight to voicemail. I sent her a few texts asking if she was okay, telling her to call me back, but there was no response. I even called Claire and Erica, hoping maybe one of them had heard from her, but they hadn't. They both reassured me that she was probably fine, just drunk and passed out somewhere, but I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls and texts from Claire and Erica, all asking the same thing. "Where's Kelly?" Apparently, none of them had heard from her either, and she hadn't made it home. I tried calling her again, but her phone was still off. By this point, I was in full-on panic mode. We called everyone we knew, trying to figure out where she could be, but no one had seen her since the party. Her phone was still off, and there was no sign of her anywhere. We went to the police later that day, explaining what had happened. They took our statements and asked a lot of questions, but it didn't feel like they were taking it as seriously as they should have. They asked if she'd been drinking, if there was any chance she'd gone off with someone without telling us, all the usual stuff. But none of it made sense. Kelly wouldn't just disappear like that, not without saying anything, not without answering her phone. The police tracked down the cab we'd been in, but the driver said the same thing he told me, that Kelly had gotten out at her stop, and he hadn't seen anything unusual. There were no records of her being dropped off, no receipts, nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Days passed, and there was still no sign of Kelly. The police did what they could, but they didn't have much to go on. No one had seen anything, and her phone was never found. The cab driver was questioned, but nothing came of it. He stuck to his story, and without any evidence, there wasn't much the police could do. Kelly's case is still open, but no one has any answers. It's been years, and she's still missing, with no trace of where she went or what happened to her. A couple of years ago, I was living in San Francisco. I just started this new job at a tech company downtown, and while the work was stressful, I really liked the people I worked with. We had this group of about 6 or 7 of us who would go out together on weekends and sometimes after work. It was a solid group. We weren't exactly best friends, but we had fun together. We were all about the same age, mostly in our mid-20s, so it was easy to just hang out, grab a drink, and blow off steam after a long week. The company was pretty laid back too. They would throw these big parties every few months to keep morale up, especially around the holidays. That year they went all out for the New Year's Eve party. It wasn't one of those awkward office things with terrible lighting and bad catering. This was a big, expensive event held at this rooftop bar in the city. I remember being excited about it because the venue had this amazing view of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you could see the whole city skyline. They'd rented out the entire place, and the guest list was basically open to anyone who worked there, plus a few plus ones. We all made plans to go together. Me, my friend Alex, and a few others from the office. We were pumped, talking about it for days leading up to the party. I remember spending the afternoon picking out what to wear, wanting to look good but not too formal. It was one of those situations where everyone wanted to look their best, but you didn't want to be that person who overdressed. When I got to Alex's place, we had a couple of drinks before grabbing an Uber to the party. The bar was as fancy as we expected. The rooftop was decked out with string lights, a couple of outdoor heaters to keep people warm, and a DJ playing music that was just loud enough to get people moving. The drinks were free, which made it easy to lose track of how much you were having, and the food was better than most of us expected. I remember thinking how over the top the whole thing was, but loving it at the same time. It felt like a reward for all the hard work we'd put in that year. We started the night off slow, grabbing drinks and hanging out on the edge of the rooftop, just admiring the view. I could see the entire city stretched out in front of us, the lights twinkling in the distance. It was one of those perfect nights where everything felt right. I had a drink in my hand, good friends around me, and the buzz of excitement building as we waited for midnight. It wasn't long before things started to get a little more chaotic. As more people showed up, the rooftop got crowded fast, the music got louder, the drinks kept flowing, and people were really starting to let loose. I wasn't worried at the time. Everyone was in a good mood, and it was a party after all. But looking back, I remember noticing that some people were getting more than a little drunk, myself included. It was one of those situations where no one was keeping track of how much they were drinking because everyone was doing it. I don't remember exactly when the argument started, but I do remember the first time I noticed something was off. It was probably around 11 p.m. and the party was at its peak. The music was pumping and most people were dancing or crowding around the bar for another round. I was with Alex and a few others, laughing about something stupid when I noticed a commotion near the other end of the rooftop. It wasn't super loud at first, just some shouting, but it was enough to catch my attention. I could see two guys arguing. One of them was this guy named Sean, someone I'd seen around the office but didn't know too well. He worked in a different department, so we hadn't really crossed paths much. The other guy, Eric, was someone I knew a little better. He was in my department and we'd hung out a few times outside of work. He was always a bit of a hothead, but I never thought much of it. At first, I assumed it was just drunk people being drunk, maybe arguing about something dumb like who was up next to buy drinks or something. But the more I watched, the more heated it got. You could tell they were both really drunk. Sean was yelling something at Eric, and Eric was in his face, clearly not backing down. People were starting to notice, turning their heads and watching to see if it was going to turn into a fight. I don't know why no one stepped in right away. Maybe it was because everyone assumed it would blow over, or maybe people just didn't want to get involved, but the tension was building fast. One second it was just shouting, and the next, Eric shoved Sean hard. It happened so fast that at first I didn't even realize what was going on. Sean stumbled backward, and before anyone could react, he tripped over the low railing that bordered the rooftop. I remember seeing him fall like it was happening in slow motion, but there wasn't enough time for anyone to stop it. He went right over the edge. For a second, there was this stunned silence, like no one could believe what had just happened. I remember my stomach dropping as I rushed to the edge of the rooftop, terrified of what I'd see. It was 4 stories down to the pavement below. I couldn't see his body from where I was standing, but I heard the sound of people screaming from the street. Everything after that was a blur. Someone was shouting to call 911, and a few people ran downstairs to try and help, but I knew it was too late. You don't fall from that height and survive. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where Sean had gone over the edge. Eric was freaking out, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair like he couldn't believe what had just happened. I don't think he meant to push him that hard. Maybe he didn't even realize the railing was so low. But none of that mattered now. Sean was dead. The police and paramedics showed up pretty quickly, but there was nothing they could do. The party came to a screeching halt as everyone realized what had just happened. Some people were crying, others were in shock, and a few were just standing around in stunned silence. It was like this horrible nightmare that none of us could wake up from. Eric was taken away by the police, still in shock, muttering to himself about how it was an accident. I don't think anyone knew what to say. We were all just standing there trying to process the fact that we had just watched someone die. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews and trying to piece together what had happened. They asked me a lot of questions, but I didn't have many answers. I wasn't close enough to hear what the argument was about, and everything had happened so fast that I could barely wrap my head around it. All I could think about was Sean going over the edge and the sound of people screaming from the street. It felt like the night dragged on forever. The police were still there when the sun started to come up, taking statements from everyone who had been there. Most of us were still in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. By the time they finally let us leave, it was well past dawn, and the city was starting to wake up. I went back to Alex's apartment, but I didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had happened. It didn't feel real. One minute we'd been having the time of our lives, and the next, someone was dead. The days after the accident were a blur. The office was quiet, almost eerie. No one knew how to act, and there were a lot of whispers about what had happened. Some people said it was just a terrible accident, that Eric hadn't meant to push him that hard. Others blamed the company for choosing a venue with such a low railing. I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, over and over, wondering if there was anything anyone could have done to stop it. Sean's death hit everyone hard, especially those who were closer to him. I hadn't known him well, but I still felt this overwhelming sense of guilt, like I should have done something even though I knew there was nothing I could have done. I think everyone who was there felt that way to some degree. I never saw Eric again after that night. He was fired, obviously, and I heard through the grapevine that there were charges filed against him, but I didn't follow up on it. I couldn't. It was too much to think about. I've always considered myself pretty careful. I know the basics. Keep an eye on your drink, don't leave it unattended, don't accept anything from strangers. It's the stuff everyone tells you when you first start going out. But no one really thinks it's going to happen to them. I sure didn't. This happened about 3 years ago when I was living in Dallas. I had just moved into a new apartment with my friend Jessica. We'd known each other since high school, so it seemed like the perfect arrangement. Splitting rent, close to work, and a lot of great bars and restaurants nearby. One of the things we were most excited about was throwing our own housewarming party. We'd been talking about it for weeks, planning the details, deciding who to invite and what drinks to buy. When the day of the party finally rolled around, everything seemed to be going perfectly. It wasn't a massive event or anything, just about 15 or 20 people, mostly friends from work and a couple of old college friends we hadn't seen in a while. The vibe was chill, and we were all just looking to have a good time. I was so focused on making sure everyone was having fun that I barely even noticed when one of Jessica's friends brought a couple of guys I didn't recognize. It wasn't a big deal at the time. It's normal for people to bring extra friends to parties. They seemed friendly enough, so I didn't think twice about it. We had set up the usual drink station with a variety of options: beer, some hard seltzers, and a few bottles of liquor. People were helping themselves, and I was bouncing between groups, catching up with friends and making sure everything was going smoothly. At some point, I made myself a vodka soda and was sipping on it while chatting with Jessica and some others. The night was in full swing by then, music blasting, people laughing, and the typical mix of party chaos that comes with these things. It was around midnight when I started to feel off. At first, I thought it was just the alcohol hitting me harder than expected. I'd only had a couple of drinks, but I figured maybe I hadn't eaten enough earlier, or maybe I was just getting tired. The room started to feel a little too hot, and I felt a wave of nausea creeping in. I excused myself from the conversation and went to sit down on the couch, hoping a few minutes of rest would help me feel better. That's when things started to get really weird. I felt dizzy, way more than I should have from just 2 drinks. My head was spinning, and my thoughts were getting jumbled. I remember trying to focus on the conversation happening around me, but everything sounded far away, like I was underwater. My hands felt heavy, like they were glued to my lap, and my body just wouldn't respond the way I wanted it to. I tried to stand up to go get some water, but my legs were wobbly and I almost collapsed right there in the living room. Jessica noticed something was wrong and came over to ask if I was okay. I tried to tell her I wasn't feeling well, but the words wouldn't come out right. It was like my mouth was moving slower than my brain, and everything felt disconnected. I could tell by the look on her face that she was concerned, but it was like I couldn't fully process what was happening. It was terrifying, feeling so out of control of my own body, and I started to panic. She helped me into my bedroom and laid me down on the bed. I thought maybe if I just closed my eyes for a minute, I would feel better. But the second I did, the world started spinning even faster. I felt like I was floating in and out of consciousness, my thoughts scattered and broken. The nausea was getting worse and the confusion was overwhelming. It wasn't like being drunk, it was something else entirely, like my brain was shutting down and I couldn't figure out why. I don't know how long I was lying there, but eventually Jessica came back to check on me. She had this worried look on her face and said they were going to take me to the hospital. I wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, that I'd be fine after some sleep, but I couldn't even get the words out. My body just felt wrong. I was scared, but too out of it to fully understand how serious it was. The next thing I remember is being in the hospital, the bright lights making my head pound even harder. I was hooked up to an IV and a nurse was asking me a bunch of questions. How many drinks I'd had, if I'd taken any drugs, if I'd eaten anything strange. I tried to answer, but it all felt like a blur. I was still too groggy to really make sense of anything, but the panic was starting to set in. Something was seriously wrong and I had no idea how it had happened. The doctors ran some tests and a few hours later, they told me what they'd found. A sedative in my system. Not just alcohol, but an actual drug. My heart dropped when I heard that. I couldn't understand how it had happened. I hadn't taken anything, and I hadn't left my drink unattended. I'd been careful, just like I always was. But someone had slipped something into my drink, and it had almost knocked me out completely. Jessica was there when they told me, and I could see the fear in her eyes too. We started going over the night in our heads, trying to figure out when it could have happened. The more we thought about it, the more terrifying it became. We had no idea who could have done it. I hadn't noticed anyone acting suspicious, and I didn't even know most of the people at the party well enough to suspect anyone specifically. After I was released from the hospital, I was in a daze for days. I felt violated, like someone had taken control of my body without my consent. The idea that someone could slip something into my drink so easily, without me even noticing, was horrifying. I started questioning everything, every detail of that night, every face I saw, every interaction I had. Jessica and I sat down and went through the guest list, trying to figure out who those random guys were. She had no idea where they came from or how they ended up at our party. None of her friends could vouch for them, and no one seemed to know much about them at all. That realization was chilling. They had just shown up, uninvited, and blended in like they belonged there. I had talked to so many people that night, I couldn't even remember if I'd spoken to them. The police got involved after the hospital report came through, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't have any evidence, no clear suspect, nothing to go on except for the fact that someone had drugged me. Without knowing who it was or when it had happened, there was no way to track the person down. It was a dead end, and that was probably the hardest part to deal with. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.